Abandoned and pregnant, Apache woman was about to give birth alone in the desert, till a lonely lumberjack found her. Chapter 1. Cast out into the wasteland, the relentless Arizona sun blazed overhead like a merciless god, its rays beating down on Ayana's swollen, exhausted body as she stumbled across the endless expanse of red sand and scattered desert brush. Her traditional Apache dress, once a beautiful display of intricate beadwork that had taken her mother months to complete, hung in tatters against her heavily pregnant form. The fabric torn by thorns and stained with dust, sweat, and the bitter tears she had shed over the past 3 days. Each labored step sent sharp waves of pain radiating through her lower back and hips, and she could feel her unborn child pressing down with increasing urgency, as if the baby sensed the desperation of their situation and was demanding entry into a world that seemed determined to reject them both before they even had a chance to fight for survival. Her dark eyes, once bright with the joy of impending motherhood, were now rimmed with the telltale signs of severe dehydration and bone-deep exhaustion, the kind that comes from walking for days without adequate water or rest. She scanned the horizon with growing desperation, searching for any sign of shelter, water, or salvation, but the desert stretched endlessly in every direction like a vast, cruel mirror, reflecting the isolation that had become her terrifying new reality since the moment her own people, the very tribe that had raised and nurtured her, had cast her out with words that still echoed in her mind, like the haunting wail of desert winds through canyon walls. The memory of that terrible day, 3 days ago, played over and over in her thoughts as she forced herself to take another painful step forward. She could still see the faces of the tribal council, men she had known since childhood, their expressions hard as stone as they delivered their devastating judgment. "You carry the child of a white soldier," the eldest had pronounced, his voice carrying the weight of ancestral law and unforgiving tradition. "You have brought shame upon our people and dishonored the blood of your ancestors. You are no longer Apache. You are no longer our daughter. You are no longer welcome among us." The words had hit her like physical blows, each syllable tearing away another piece of her identity, her belonging, her very sense of self. Her husband, Nalnish, a respected warrior whose prowess in battle had earned him status and honor among their people, had stood among the other men, his face turned away in shame, unable or unwilling to meet her pleading gaze as she silently begged him to speak in her defense, to fight for her, to choose their love over the harsh judgment of tradition. But he had remained silent, his silence more devastating than any words of condemnation could have been. And she had understood in that moment that she was truly alone in the world now, as another powerful contraction gripped her body like an iron band tightening around her midsection. She pressed her palm against the scorching surface of a large boulder, the red rock so hot it nearly burned her calloused skin, even through years of desert living. The baby kicked violently inside her womb, as if sensing the mortal danger they both faced. Ayana found herself whispering ancient Apache prayers to the spirits of her ancestors, the same ancestors whose blood the council claimed she had dishonored. She begged them to guide her to water, to shelter, to any form of salvation that might allow her child to survive, even if she herself did not. Her throat was parched beyond description, her tongue swollen and her lips cracked and bleeding from the dry desert air that seemed to steal moisture from her very lungs with each labored breath. Every muscle in her body screamed for rest, for relief, for the simple mercy of shade. But she knew with the clarity born of desperation that stopping now meant certain death for both herself and her unborn child. The afternoon heat was beginning to give way to the approaching evening, and while the thought of cooler temperatures offered some hope, she was acutely aware that desert nights brought their own deadly challenges. The temperature would plummet, leaving her exposed to cold that could kill just as surely as the heat, and predators that hunted in the darkness. As she struggled forward, her water having run out the previous day, she began to accept the terrible possibility that she might die here in this desolate place, forgotten by the world, with no one to even know what had become of her or her child. The thought filled her with a grief so profound it seemed to weigh more than the child she carried. But it also sparked something else within her, a fierce, primal determination that burned brighter than the desert sun. She would not let her baby die without a fight. She would not allow the judgment of others to determine their fate. If she was going to bring this child into the world in the middle of a wasteland, then she would do so with all the strength and courage her Apache blood could provide, even if that very blood had been deemed unworthy by those who should have protected her. Another contraction seized her, stronger and more prolonged than any before, and she doubled over, clutching her swollen belly and fighting back tears of pain and desperation. The vast silence of the desert was broken only by her labored breathing. The whisper of wind through dried grass, the distant cry of a circling hawk that seemed to be waiting patiently for what it sensed was coming. In that moment of profound isolation, with death circling overhead and pain consuming her body, Ayanna made a silent vow to the child she carried. Somehow, someway, she would find the strength to give her baby a chance at life, even if it cost her everything she had left to give. Thomas McKenna wiped the sweat from his weathered, sun-beaten brow with the back of his work-worn hand as he guided his horse-drawn cart along the barely visible trail that wound its way through the desert foothills like a faint scar across the landscape. The 42-year-old lumberjack had been working these remote and unforgiving areas for nearly 2 decades, cutting timber in the sparse forests that dotted the higher elevations where pine and oak trees managed to find enough water to survive, then hauling the precious wood back to the growing settlements that were slowly but steadily pushing into this harsh frontier territory. His hands, calloused from years of wielding axes and saws, gripped the leather reins with the practiced ease of a man who had learned to read every mood of the animals under his care. But his pale blue eyes held a deep wariness that spoke of years spent in self-imposed solitude, carrying burdens that no amount of physical labor could seem to lighten. The lines etched into his face told the story of a man who had seen both joy and profound sorrow, who had loved deeply and lost everything that mattered, leaving him to find what peace he could in the honest work of his hands and the vast, indifferent beauty of the wilderness, since losing his beloved wife Martha to the fever that had swept through their settlement 5 years ago, taking not only her but also their youngest son, who had been barely 3 years old. Thomas had deliberately chosen the isolation of this harsh country over the painful memories that haunted him in more populated areas, where every familiar face reminded him of what he had lost. The other 2 children, grown and married, had their own lives in distant towns, and while they wrote occasionally, the letters only served to remind him of the family gatherings and shared meals that would never happen again. His only regular companions now were his 2 faithful horses, Belle and Buck, sturdy animals who had learned to navigate the treacherous terrain as skillfully as their master, and the occasional conversation with fellow travelers brave enough or desperate enough to venture into these remote regions where civilization existed only as a distant memory. The cart behind him carried his modest supplies and the well-maintained tools of his trade, everything he needed to sustain his simple, solitary existence in a world that had grown to quiet since Martha's laughter had been silenced forever. As the afternoon sun began its slow descent toward the jagged western mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded him painfully of Martha's favorite dress, Thomas was mentally calculating how much daylight remained for his journey back to his isolated cabin when a sound stopped him as surely as if he had run into an invisible wall. It was faint at first, barely audible over the creaking of his cartwheels and the steady clip-clop of his horse's hooves, but unmistakably human. A woman's cry of pain that was raw and desperate and filled with an anguish that seemed to echo off the surrounding rocks and carry on the hot desert wind. He pulled hard on the reins with such sudden force that Belle and Buck snorted in surprise, bringing his cart to an immediate halt, and stood up in his seat, his heart beginning to race. As he strained to listen over the settling sounds of his equipment and the heavy breathing of his animals, there it was again, clearer this time and more urgent, coming from somewhere beyond a cluster of red rock formations that rose from the desert floor, like ancient monuments to some forgotten civilization. Without a moment's hesitation, Thomas grabbed his precious water canteen and a thick woolen blanket from his carefully organized supplies, his mind racing with a mixture of deep concern and utter disbelief as he tried to process what he was hearing. What in God's name would a woman be doing? Alone out here, miles and miles from the nearest settlement in country so harsh that even experienced men rarely traveled it alone. He had encountered Apache bands before during his years in this territory, always maintaining a respectful distance and showing proper caution. But this cry sounded different, not the voice of someone who belonged in this landscape, but rather someone in desperate trouble, filled with a kind of distress that transcended language, culture, or the bitter history between their peoples. Leaving his cart secured with heavy rocks placed behind the wheels, he began scrambling over the rocky, treacherous terrain toward the source of the sound. His worn leather boots sliding on loose sand and scattered pebbles as he moved as quickly as his aging legs would carry him, driven by an urgency he hadn't felt since the night Martha had gone into labor with their first child. The cries were becoming more frequent now, and even with his limited experience, he could recognize the unmistakable rhythm and intensity of a woman in the final stages of labor. His pulse quickened with a combination of fear and determination as he realized exactly what he was walking into. And memories of Martha's own difficult pregnancies came flooding back to him with painful clarity. The long hours of waiting, the moments of terror when something seemed to go wrong, the incredible relief and joy when new life finally entered the world. As he crested a small ridge, breathing hard from the exertion and the adrenaline coursing through his veins, he finally saw her, a young Apache woman, clearly in the advanced stages of labor, crouched behind a large boulder that provided the only meager shade available, with no shelter, no water, no supplies, and no help in sight except for the weather-beaten lumberjack who had heard her cries and come running toward. What might be the most important moment of his life since the day he had lost everything that mattered to him? In that instant, as their eyes met across the cultural and racial divide that had defined their people's relationship for generations, and Thomas McKenna knew that nothing would ever be the same again. When Thomas first laid eyes on Ayanna, crouched in the meager shade of the boulder with her face contorted in agony, he was struck not only by her obviously desperate condition, but by the fierce, almost defiant determination that blazed in her dark eyes even through her pain, despite the obvious exhaustion that had left her trembling and dehydrated, despite the terror that any woman would feel facing childbirth alone in such a desolate place. She looked up at him with eyes that held no surrender, no acceptance of defeat, only the primal, unbreakable strength of a mother who would fight to her last breath for her child's chance at life. For a long moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, they simply stared at each other across the vast cultural divide that had defined their people's relationship for generations. The grizzled, white settler, with his weathered hands and kind eyes, and the young Apache woman whose beauty remained evident even through her suffering. Brought together by circumstances that neither could have imagined in their wildest dreams or darkest nightmares. The air between them crackled with tension, uncertainty, and the unspoken recognition that this moment would change both of their lives forever, regardless of what happened in the hours to come. "Easy now, easy," Thomas said softly, his voice gentle and reassuring as he raised both hands in a universal gesture of peace, approaching slowly and carefully the way he might approach a wounded wild animal that could either flee or attack, depending on how threatened it felt. He could see the wariness that flickered in her dark eyes, the way her body tensed despite the waves of pain washing over her. And he understood with the clarity of a man who had lived through his own share of tragedy and loss that she had every reason in the world to fear him. The history between their peoples was written in blood and betrayal, in broken treaties and burned villages, and stories of violence and mistrust that had been passed down through generations like bitter heirlooms. But when another powerful contraction seized her, causing her to cry out with a sound that seemed to tear at the very fabric of the desert silence, any concerns about racial differences or historical animosities evaporated like morning dew in the face of immediate, desperate human need. This wasn't about Apache and white settler. It's about the complex politics of the frontier, or about the prejudices and fears that divided their worlds. This was about a woman who was about to give birth and needed help, knowledge and compassion to provide it. Thomas had helped deliver 3 of his own children with Martha, and he had assisted neighbors and friends during medical emergencies over the years. So he quickly assessed the situation with the practical eye of a man who had faced life-and-death challenges before and understood that action mattered more than worry. The woman was clearly in the final stages of labor, severely dehydrated and physically exhausted from what must have been days of wandering in this merciless landscape. But she was still strong enough to have survived this long, which meant she had the constitution to make it through childbirth if she received the right help and support. He immediately knelt beside her and offered his water canteen, gesturing for her to drink while speaking in the gentlest tone he could manage. And he was deeply moved by the profound gratitude that flickered across her face as she accepted his help with trembling hands that spoke of desperate thirst, and the kind of relief that comes when hope returns to a hopeless situation. Communication proved challenging at first, with Thomas speaking in simple English, supplemented by hand gestures and expressions, while Ayanna responded in Apache mixed with the broken English she had learned from traders and soldiers over the years. But as the labor progressed and the urgency of the situation demanded cooperation, they developed an understanding that transcended language barriers, his steady presence, and gentle encouragement, providing the emotional support she desperately needed, while her trust in his obvious desire to help allowed him to provide the practical assistance that could mean the difference between life and death. He worked quickly to fashion a makeshift shelter using his wool blanket and some fallen branches he gathered from nearby, creating precious shade that offered relief from the sun's brutal assault, while also providing a sense of privacy and security that helped calm her fears. When he tore strips from his spare shirt to use as clean cloths, when he positioned himself to help catch the baby, when he spoke constantly in soothing tones, even though he wasn't sure how much she understood, Ayanna felt something she hadn't experienced since her banishment began. The presence of another human being who cared about her welfare and was willing to sacrifice his own comfort and safety to help her through the most vulnerable moment of her life. When the baby finally came after what felt like hours of intense labor, emerging into the world as a healthy, beautiful girl with powerful lungs that announced her arrival to the entire desert with lusty cries that seemed to echo off the surrounding rocks, Thomas felt tears streaming down his weathered, sun-beaten cheeks as emotions he had kept carefully buried for 5 years came rushing to the surface like water from a broken dam. He had forgotten the miraculous nature of birth, the way it could transform even the harshest and most desperate circumstances into something beautiful and hopeful and filled with infinite possibility. As he helped clean the infant with strips of cloth dampened with precious water from his canteen, as he wrapped her tiny body in a corner of the blanket to keep her warm and safe, he watched Ayanna's face transform from pain and exhaustion to wonder and then to the fierce, protective love that he remembered so well from Martha's face when each of their children had first been placed in her arms. In broken English mixed with Apache words he didn't understand, but whose meaning was clear from her tone and expression, she whispered thank you over and over again, her dark eyes meeting his blue ones with a gratitude so profound and sincere that it seemed to bridge every difference between them. Differences of race, culture, language, and history that had seemed insurmountable just hours before, but now felt as insignificant as dust in the wind compared to the miracle they had just witnessed together in the middle of one of the most desolate places on earth. In the days and weeks that followed the miraculous birth in the desert, Thomas McKenna made a decision that surprised even himself and would have shocked anyone who had known the solitary, grief-stricken man he had become after Martha's death. He simply could not bring himself to leave Ayanna and her newborn daughter alone in the wilderness to face an uncertain and probably tragic fate. The practical part of his mind, the part that had kept him alive and functioning through 5 years of isolation and sorrow, told him that he had done his good deed, that he had saved 2 lives, and should feel satisfied with that accomplishment. But something deeper and more fundamental refused to let him walk away from the woman who had shown such incredible courage in the tiny baby, whose first cries had awakened feelings in him that he thought had died with his own family. Using his extensive knowledge of the area gained through 2 decades of working this harsh territory, He led them to a small, natural cave system he had discovered years earlier while tracking wounded deer. A hidden sanctuary complete with a fresh water spring that bubbled up from deep underground aquifers, creating a small oasis that few people knew existed in this seemingly barren landscape. The cave provided perfect shelter from both the scorching heat of desert days and the bone-chilling cold of desert nights, while the spring meant they could stay there safely and comfortably while Ayana recovered her strength and made plans for whatever future awaited her and her child. Thomas found himself making the journey between his own cabin and the hidden cave almost daily, bringing supplies, food, blankets, and other necessities, but more importantly, bringing human companionship to someone who had been utterly and completely alone in the world. As they settled into this temporary arrangement that somehow began to feel more permanent with each passing day, he learned fragments of Ayana's heartbreaking story through their gradually improving communication. Piecing together the tragic tale of how she had been cast out by her own people for carrying what they believed to be a white soldier's child, and how her husband, a man she had loved and trusted, had been forced to choose between his wife and his standing in the tribe, and had chosen his social position over their marriage. The pain in her voice when she spoke of this ultimate betrayal was evident even through the language barrier and her careful attempts to maintain dignity in the face of such devastating rejection, and Thomas found himself sharing his own story of loss and abandonment, telling her about Martha and the children they had raised together before fever had swept through their settlement like the angel of death, taking away everything that had given his life meaning and purpose. There was something profoundly healing in these exchanges, as if to people who had been carrying their individual burdens of grief and loss in complete isolation, were finally able to share the weight with someone who truly understood what it is meant to have your entire world collapse and leave you struggling to find reasons to continue living. The conversations were halting and sometimes frustrating as they worked through the language barriers. But the emotional connection that grew between them needed no translation. They recognized in each other the same deep wounds, the same struggle to rebuild meaning and hope from the ashes of destroyed dreams. Thomas began making regular but careful trips to the nearest trading post, a rough establishment that served the scattered ranchers, miners, and settlers who scratched out livings in this unforgiving territory, always mindful that he needed to purchase supplies without revealing their location or raising suspicions about why a solitary lumberjack suddenly needed baby clothes, extra blankets, and supplies for a nursing mother. He brought not just the practical necessities of survival, but small luxuries that brought smiles to Ayana's face, fresh fruit when he could find it, colored ribbons for her long black hair, a hand mirror that allowed her to see her reflection for the first time since her banishment began. As weeks turned into months, he found himself looking forward to these visits with an anticipation and joy that he hadn't experienced since the early days of his marriage to Martha, when coming home each evening had meant warmth, laughter, and the simple pleasure of being with someone who was genuinely happy to see him, watching Ayana care for her daughter, whom she had named Nasha, meaning owl in Apache, after the bird that had circled overhead during her birth, filled a void in Thomas's life that he hadn't even realized was still there, still aching for the chance to nurture and protect and be part of something larger than his own solitary existence. The baby thrived under her mother's devoted care and the security of their protected environment. Her initial cries of hunger and discomfort gradually replaced by the softer sounds of contentment, gurgling laughter, peaceful sleep, and the tiny noises that healthy babies make when they feel safe and loved. When Thomas finally gathered the courage to broach the subject of their future together, suggesting with careful delicacy that Ayana and Nasha could come to live near his cabin, where he could provide ongoing protection and support, where they could build something resembling a real home together, he was surprised by the powerful surge of hope that rose in his chest. Hope for a future that involved more than just solitary survival and the gradual wearing away of years until death finally provided escape from loneliness. Ayana's response came not in words, which would have been inadequate to express the complexity of her feelings, but in the way she reached out and gently touched his weathered, work-worn hand with her slender fingers, a gesture that spoke eloquently of trust, profound gratitude, and perhaps the tentative beginning of something that neither of them had expected to find in the harsh but beautiful vastness of the desert a second chance at family, at belonging, at the kind of love that grows not from passion and romance, but from shared struggle, mutual respect, and the recognition that sometimes the most unlikely people can become exactly what each other needs to heal old wounds and build new dreams. In that moment, as the desert wind whispered through the cave entrance and baby Nasha slept peacefully in her mother's arms, Thomas and Ayana both understood that they had found something precious and rare, not just survival, but the possibility of happiness discovered in the last place either of them would have thought to look for it. Born from a chance encounter that had transformed broken lives into the foundation of something whole and hopeful and worth fighting to protect,